Okay, what we're doing here is creating the rectangle for the step value chart, and then after that we're going to create the rectangle for the gradient chart. And this is for painting in your 5 values with your gouache or watercolor, and you'll be using your black and your white watercolor or gouache. So for what you want to do first is measure out at least 2 inches down, because you want to do so go about 1/2 inch down and measure out a 10 inch across on your paper, and then measure 2 inches down from that, and then that'll give you the top and the sides of your rectangle. And then you want to go and create the bottom line. So you create the rectangle, and you're going to create a 2 by 10 inch rectangle, and then when you divide that up into 5 different 2-inch boxes, that'll be exactly 5 2-inch boxes. And then you're going to label them number 1 through 5. Don't label them there within the boxes, but just where you want to label them is right above, or if you're right above or below, as long as you don't put your gradient box below that. So now I'm measuring out my gradient box here, and I'm just placing it right below where I had put the step box with the 5 value steps there. So you do the same thing where you create another rectangle, a 2-inch by 10-inch rectangle, and you're going to use that rectangle for your gradient. So while I'm drawing the rectangle box, you should be drawing yours about this time if you haven't already done this exercise, but you should be drawing your 2 rectangles out, your 2 10-inch by 2-inch rectangles, one for your 5-step gradient, for your 5-step value chart, and one for your gradient. Look around and see that I've already prepped my space. I've got 2 containers for water for my gouache. I've got my palette out. I've got a whole set of brushes over there. And then I've got some cloth out also, so that way I've got something that I can use to wipe my excess water off of my brush when we get there. So now I'm tick marking every 2 inches here, and this is going to allow me to have and create those 5 2-inch squares. And I want you to create 5 2-inch squares so that way you can go back in and have enough surface area where you can start getting a nice practice. So this is what you should wind up with. You should wind up with a chart that's like this, where you've got 5 2-inch squares, and right underneath it you've got a 10-inch by 2-inch rectangle. And so if you see you've got 5, and just right above each of those, number it 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Number 1 is going to be for your white, and number 5 is going to be for your black. So now you're ready to paint. You get your tubes of gouache, and I couldn't quite open the gouache that you guys use for the class, because they were they're from last year, and I would need to loosen those tops up in water. And so just to get on with the video, I switched brands, but this shouldn't affect the way your results should look, because even though this is a higher grade of paint, I'm using my Holbeins here, and the 2 other off to the side over there are some Dick Blick watercolors, and those would be acceptable to use for this project too. So I'm setting out some black paint, and you see I just put a little pile out because I don't want to waste too much paint. And you see that my palette's already, it may look like it's dirty, but that's because the nature of gouache and watercolor allows you to reactivate it. So I can go back in there with clean water and take my brush and reactivate that. So now I'm wetting a brush and getting it ready to paint. I'm going to have problems with this brush. And I'll be putting this one away, but it will, at least I'll get it started. So that is also part of what you want to do. Is you're going to be, after you finish this exercise, you're going to be going into the bottom half of your paper and doing some, and actually you can do it before or after. I told you before that to do it before, but I suggest doing it before you actually do this exercise, because then you're going to get a little bit of more of a test drive, and you can play around with your brushes, and you'll be a little more familiar with your brushes. And since I'm already familiar with my brushes and I'm a pro at this, I'm going to go ahead and go in and not give my brushes a test drive, but I want you to test drive your brushes down in the bottom half by making stars and like maybe hearts or circles, or just random like maybe amoeba type shapes or a leaf or any shape that comes to mind. And I want you to play with your brushes and see what they do. So now here is where I'm just taking that black paint and I put a little bit of white into it, and I'm mixing up a little bit of a gray there just to show you how to mix paint. And I'm going to be showing you what consistency you want and giving you a little bit of a demo about brushes too. But I'm going to be putting this brush away because I tried using it, but I see that I didn't like it because it just didn't quite do what I needed it to do, because it had some stray hairs. So you see that what I've done is I put a piece of cloth down, so this way if I want to rest my hand on my paper I can, and this will help keep your work nice and clean. And our hands always have oil on them because that's just the nature of being human. So you want to always put a little protector down on your paper if you're going to be putting your hand on your paper. Okay, so I guess never mind all that stuff about the bad brush. I had a good brush. I guess I edited that out. Anyway, so I've just got black paint here, and what I'm doing here is I'm taking the side of the brush that I'm using there, and I'm doing an outline of my box, because it's critical that you try to stay within the lines. That's what you want to do, is try to stay within the lines, because what you're trying to do here is gain control, gain mastery over your tools, over the materials that you're working with. So when you first start painting, this is called a dry into dry technique, and you're going, a wet into dry technique, and you're going to be taking a wet paint and working on dry paper. So that's why it's called wet into dry, because you're using a wet pigment and you're going into a dry paper. And there's, because the nature of watercolor and gouache is that if you have water on your paper, your pigment is going to travel wherever your water is. So your pigment is going to flow there. It'll flow there to different degrees, but if your paper's wet, your watercolor or your gouache pigment's going to flow. So you see, now I'm showing you what the consistency of that black paint is. I thought I was mixing gray before, but sorry about that. But I'm just dragging black out from the initial little pile there, and that reflection there of the light is making it look a little gray, but that's actually just pure black. So, and I'm putting that in my number 5 square, because my number 1 square is already done. With the white square, number 1, with watercolor and gouache, when you want to do white, you just leave the white of the paper, and that is what establishes the white in your design or any painting that you might be working on. So now what I'm doing here is, now that I've gotten that consistency, and you saw that it didn't have too much flow, it didn't go running down the palette, it sort of stayed in place there. So that's the consistency that you're looking for. And you see how I'm brushing the paint out of the little pile every single time, and that's working the physicality of the paint, and it lets me know what the flow of the paint is. It lets me know how I get a feeling of how it's responding to the surface of the palette, and then it's going to respond to the surface of the paper slightly different, but you'll be able to do like an analogous comparison and understand how it feels on your palette and be able to relate that to how it's going to deposit and how it's going to look and how it's going to fill on your paper. So you want to fill each little square and try to get them as close to all one value as possible. So you want your black square, your number 5 square, to be all black, and fill it till it is all black, and you want to stay as close within the lines as possible. You see here I'm using my flat brush, and when I'm going down and painting those big long strokes, you see I'm using the wide edge of the brush, but when I did the fine outlines, I used the thin edge of a brush. So you can use your brush, it's versatile. You don't have to only use it in one direction. You can use it in any direction that you want, and you can play. That's one of the other things you do when you are working over the surface of your palette, is you're shaping the tip of your brush too. So this way it's going to deposit the way you want it to. So now I suggest and recommend going into your middle square, your number 3, and that's what I'm doing here. So now I'm taking out some of that white paint, and I'm going to mix up a mid-tone that is halfway between white and halfway between black. So I'm just taking some of the white paint and I'm just guessing, and since I've got the white paint right there and the black paint right there, I'm going to mix up a tone that I feel, according to just my own guess and the way I analyze and gauge, I'm going to look at that and say, well, to me this is halfway between that blackest of blacks that I've got and the white. And then I'm going to take that and I'm going to mix up a nice amount, and I'm going to even use the information that I got from before with how much paint I used when I painted my black square. I'm going to use that information to gauge how much of this gray I should mix up, so that way I have enough and it's all one value, and I'm going to have enough to fill that area that I'm looking to fill. And you see I'm mixing the paint around, but you don't want to squish your brush and mess up your hairs too much. So you see I'm mostly using it on its flat edge, and even though it looks like I'm going around, I'm slightly lifting that, and then I'm mostly stroking it just one direction, and I'm swishing it around a lot, but I'm using that flat edge. So you may have seen me dip into the dirty water, and that's okay because I'm mixing a gray tone anyway, so it's not as if I really need clear water to do this. So now I'm doing the same thing where I'm using the thin edge of my brush, and when you load all of that paint on your brush, you also want to gauge how much paint you actually have on your brush, because you don't want to have so much paint on your brush that when you put it down on your paper, it just all deposits all over your paper out of control. So you want to start, that's why I have you doing the playing around and doing the other shapes. So this way when you get to your nice pristine squares, you'll have a little bit more experience behind you already. So here I am doing that nice outline of the mid-tone, the number 3 box, and I'm outlining my box. So this way I'm going to be able to stay inside the lines as much as possible, because the name of the game is control. You want to be able to control the medium, not let the medium just go anywhere it wants to. So you can let it go anywhere it wants to once you understand where letting it go anywhere it wants to goes to. Then you can use that randomness in your design, incorporate it in. But for now we're doing a controlled design. So you see I'm using the thick edge of my brush, pulling those strokes down and filling in that square as much as possible. And even I will forget some of my good habits, because you see here that I did not get my cloth, and I'm putting my lovely hand that's nice and lotioned up down on my paper. And that's okay, because it's not as if we're doing this for an archival project. But when you're doing your archival paintings and you don't want them to yellow across time, that's one of the reasons you don't put your hands or your fingers, you don't touch your paper too much, because you'll deposit oil on there, and across time your paper will yellow and turn brittle. So now there's my beautiful mid-tone square. So now you can decide to do one or the other. You can do number 2 or you can do number 4. And let's see which one I'm going to do. I don't remember, but it's a mystery right now. It looks like I've chose to do number 2. Nope. Looks like I'm choosing to do square number 4 because I'm taking more of my black paint and adding it into that existing paint that I already just mixed for my square 3. Because one thing I want to make sure that I do is I want to make sure that I use that paint before and I use that as my gauge and make sure that the new little batch of paint I mix up is darker than what I used in square number 3 and lighter than the pure black that I have there in the palette. So that's a real nice way to gauge your values, or even when we get into color, it's a real nice way to gauge your color because you'll be using the idea of value with color too. So you do that right like I've done there, where you leave a nice amount of paint from before and you can do some really nice comparative things and you've got it right there in your palette, and that becomes a really important part of your toolbox. So I'm doing the same thing here where I'm outlining, but you see I don't really need to outline the side boxes because they're already outlined for me by virtue of number 3 and number 5 already being filled in. You see I'm using the wide flat angle of my brush, and again I hope I mixed up enough that I'm going to be able to fill that whole box there. And you see about how much warp the paper is getting. You see it's getting a little teeny tiny more warped than it was before. And this is, and you can even see how wet I've got the brush by virtue of that reflection you're seeing on that on the paper. So that's about how much water you want to work with. You don't want to make it too wet. And you can also look at the transparency of your paint, and that'll let you see. That'll help you gauge what your value is too. You see how you can see the paper through, or rather the surface of the palette through there. So I'm cleaning my brush off, and because I've completed square number 3, or rather 4, and so now I'm going to mix up a nice light gray that's somewhere between white and that mid-tone number 3. And rather than going into my palette there where I've got my dark, I'm going to mix up just in the next pot, the next little panel of the palette. I'm just mixing it up right there, and I'm making sure that I still stick with that same viscosity, that same flow, that same amount of water to pigment ratio that I've been working with that worked for me before. So now I'm going to mix something up that's going to be darker than that number 3 that I still have there, and I mean rather lighter than that number 3 that's there, but yet darker than white. And for this I don't really need to compare the white to the white paint because I can compare it right there to the white on the surface of the palette right there. So now you see I'm putting an outline in on the one side, and looks like I'm putting it in on all 4 sides here. Woo, play by play. So I'm putting that in there, and because I've already gotten a little more comfortable with the use of my brush, I cheated and I went ahead and filled that square in without even doing my outline because I'm feeling more confident with making brush strokes now too. And you'll see that you'll build that kind of confidence too. So as you go on, you see that you'll build that confidence, and then maybe you'll remember your good habits of working with the cloth under your hand too. You'll bring that back in. If you slip, that's just up to you, whether or not you want to build those kind of habits. So now that is what a completed grayscale, 5-step grayscale looks like. And I'm just cleaning my brushes off. And now I'm going to show you a wet into wet technique. And you see I put a little bit of water, clean water on my brush. I probably didn't clean it enough. So I don't know what I was explaining there, but I probably already got through it. And I think I've got a little bit too much water on my brush. I probably should have dabbed a little bit of it off. So what I'm saying here is that you see on the white side, remember when I said if you put water, that's where the paint will go. So when you're doing your gradient, you're going to start putting your water down on the black side, and by the time you get to about halfway through your white area, you want to make sure you don't put any water down there, because if you put water down, then the paint's going to flow into it. And remember, for white, when you're working with gouache or watercolor, or you want to, you can just use the surface of the paper as your white values. You don't need to put in white paint. You just put in white. You just leave the white of the paper to do the work for you. So you probably don't need quite as much water as I've put down. I know I put a little bit more water down than would have been ideal. But you want to make sure you get the entire area just damp. If you get it a little too wet, a really good thing you can do is just take one of those cloths you have there, like a paper towel or a cloth, and just take that and press it down over the entire area, and it'll take up a nice amount of the flow of the water, but it'll keep your paper nice and damp, so that way when you put the paint down, it just naturally starts diffusing. And that's what the good thing about wet into wet. So you see, I definitely used too much water. You can see even the warp happening there. I could have used, where on this one, I could have gone back in and given that a little bit of pat and take up some of the water. But I was eager to make the video, and so I should have, could have made it less wet. But that, and you'll see what happens because I've got it a little too wet, that the paint flows a little bit more than what you want. So what you want to do here is when you go into your gradient value chart, what I was pointing out is that you want to use the lines in the square above it to help you gauge where you should be making transitions. So between each one of those, you want to be making transitions. So about halfway through your black square, or what would be your black square, but think of it more as your black area in your gradient. About halfway through where your black square is above, you want to stop painting the pure black in and start bringing in those values of your number 4 gray. So you see I'm going a little side to side to already encourage the blending of the values and to get some of those transitions to start happening a little bit more naturally. You see that I've got a little pot of black over on the side that I'm using, and that's because with your palettes, you don't have to clean your palettes out after you use them, and especially if you're going to be using those same colors going forward. So since you're going to be using this same palette going into your grayscale, your next grayscale project, you can really conserve your paints by not washing these out afterwards. Just go ahead and letting the paint dry, and you can go right back into it with clean water, and it's called reactivating it. So all of that, you see that gray I have in that third pan over there, that's from me using this. And I just use, for me, I use my grayscale palette. I just keep one grayscale palette, and because I do quite a bit of painting, I have several different palettes that I use for my excuse me, my color painting. So, but for my grayscale palette, I always just keep one grayscale palette, and you see that I've got white paint there in one of the little side pans, and I've got black paint in there in the other little side pan. So you see now that here where I am in the timeline, if you will, of the gradient. Now I'm bringing in more of the number 4 gray, and by the time I get to the halfway point, so I'm going to bring in where it's just nothing but that number 4 gray. And you see it, because I have enough left over from when I did my step scale, I can use some of those. So I've already got it pre-mixed, and it you can really work a lot more efficiently if you keep your palette nice and active like that. And it's, you know, you can just keep yourself a nice, really good workflow, and you'll have a lot more consistency within your paint, because everything will relate to each other because you're using the same palette. So now I'm taking the number 4 with some of that leftover number 3 and making a whole new value out of that. And that's what I'm using for my transitions between the area right below number 4 and number 3. And then when I get, so I'm taking that about to the halfway point. You see how I'm blending between the two surfaces too? I'm just taking that brush and doing like a little zigzag motion, and then I take it straight down, and that does something of a blending motion. So, and I'm noticing that because there was a little bit too much water, my paint is dispersing more, and it's not staying on the surface where I wanted it to. It's moving over to some of the other surfaces, and that's changing the value structure of my gradient. So that's why I'm going back in here. I went back in with a little bit more of a dark paint. So you want to keep an eye on things, and if you see something like that happening, go back in and see if you can make those corrections. So now I'm ready to jump ahead. And I am taking some of that number 2 paint and mixing it in with the number 3. Or maybe I ran out of a little bit of the number 3 paint, and so I'm mixing a new little pot of it, where about gauging what it looks like and where I might actually want those transitions or the breaks to fall. So it looks like I'm going back in and trying to make some of those adjustments. And most of these adjustments are due to having too much water on my surface when I first started. And too much water is just only a relative term. It's relative to the effect you're trying to get. So since I'm trying to do a controlled effect here, it would be better to have just a little less water, because the more water you have on your surface, the less control you're going to have, and the more control the water is going to have. And it's going to take it and take your pigment and roll it where it wants to, disperse it where it wants to. So the less water you have on your surface, the more control you have over it. So I'm still doing those sideways mark. You're not forced to do this, but you might find this would work for you too. So it might be something you might want to try when you're taking your test drive with your brushes from your set. So now I'm going in and doing the last area, the area that is right below box number 2, above in the step gradient, or the step chart rather. And you see I'm using that same little sideways thing to diffuse the paint out, and never going into that last little area of the white box there at the end with any paint at all. So now I'm going to show you I'm looking at it now, and I feel like some of the paint has moved a little, so I'm going in and trying to make some adjustments, adding a little pigment in where I think it makes sense to add more in, to try to get that gradient to be more from the black and transition in the same steps as the step chart above, but instead of having those hard steps, have just a nice diffused break in it. So what I'm doing now is I've lifted my paper up and I'm moving it around, and because I've got enough water on the surface, I'm just letting the surface, the gravity move those move the pigment around a little, because you'll see that it can flow on the surface, and even that will give you a really nice diffused look too, where you can tilt your paper back and forth and get a really nice diffusion happening, just because the so you see that, how you just tilt the paper back and forth, that'll give you a really nice diffusion, because the physics of the world we live in will take over, and it'll let your paint roll up or down your paper because you put it vertically. So you should end up with a nice pretty little box like this for your gradient chart, and then right underneath it, or your gradient charts, and right underneath it you should have your little, okay, you should have your little taking your test drive with your paintbrush. So that's what I'm describing here. So from all of your sets that you had, from all the brushes of the sets that you have, you want to take these brushes for a test drive and see what they do. Like, you want to see if you can leave the tip of a round brush, see how broad of a stroke you can get with that. See if you roll the brush a little in your palette and you can get a nice refined tip on it. If you've got a brush like this where it's got a slant, take it in both directions. With your flat brushes, take that in both directions too. See what, see if you can make a squiggly mark, see if you can make a square mark.